Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Hi. We're just about to begin, and I think there'll be other people kind of filtering in as this starts. But it's my absolute pleasure tonight to welcome David J. Getsy to the MCA Australia. My name is Tim Riley-Walsh, and I am the Assistant Curator here at the Museum of Contemporary Art Australia. I begin this evening by acknowledging the Gadigal people, the traditional owners of the lands and waters on which we are meeting and listening, Tullawallata on the shores of Warang. I wish to pay my respects to elders, past and present, and extend that acknowledgement to any First Nations peoples and colleagues who are joining us this evening. I also recognise that sovereignty was never ceded in this country. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Before I introduce David, I'm going to begin with a few important thank yous on behalf of the museum. Firstly, to the Power Institute, to their director, Mark Ledbury, and also Nicholas Croggan for his stewardship of tonight's event. Co-presented as part of MCA and Power's visual research program, this event is just one outcome of a 3-year collaborative partnership between the MCA and the Power Institute, which aims to explore and showcase new ways of conducting research on contemporary art and visual culture. I also want to acknowledge that David's visit to Australia has been made possible thanks to the support of the ANU Research School of Humanities and the Art. And a little point of housekeeping that after David's paper this evening, there will be an opportunity for questions, and so please kind of keep that in mind, let that kind of stew, and we look forward to kind of fielding those at the end. There will be a mic roving around, so if you can just wait to receive the mic before you ask the question, that old thing that we'll all forget probably by the end. But really now onto the task at hand. And on behalf of the MCA, I have the really great pleasure of introducing this evening's speaker, David J. Getsy. Can I also say, and no offence to the museum, it is perhaps a grander pleasure to welcome David to Sydney as a member of and on behalf of the LGBTQI plus community here. A community who really cherishes David's generosity of thought and all he does to further our culture and the thinking around it. And I'm really gauging this anecdotally, I have to say, from the amount of DMs that I've received in response to posts about David's lecture. So I'm really kind of excited to hear that sort of support. So really it's with much anticipation, clearly on many fronts. We've been looking forward to our moment to hear from David. Tonight, David's paper is entitled Unnatural Relations, Queer Abstraction and the Intercourse of Forms in Contemporary Art. David joins us all the way from the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, where he is the inaugural Eleanor Shea Professor of Art History. David has been in Australia for the last little while, presenting, and I think it's been a couple of weeks actually, presenting what I'm told was an excellent keynote as part of the AAANZ conference. And for its 50th anniversary this year, the conference was pointedly titled Past, Present, Possible Futures. On that note, let me touch just briefly on David's past before we dive really into the present moment of this lecture. David studied at Oberlin College, where he received his honours in 1995, then his MA and PhD at Northwestern in 2002. He went on to teach at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago from 2005 to 2021, holding from 2011 the Goldabelle McComb Finn Distinguished Professor of Art History, and since 2022, Professor Emeritus. His fellowships and awards are numerous and significant, most recently in 2023 when he received the Award for Excellence in the Arts and Humanities from the University of Virginia. David has published 8 books, including 2022's Queer Behaviour, Scott Burton, and Performance Art, a subject which David is an expert on and has been quite occupied by in the last little while. And then, of course, 2015's much-loved Abstract Bodies, 60s Sculpture in the Expanded Field of Gender, and the widely read and regarded 2016 anthology of artists' writings, Queer. David's vital scholarship sits at the intersection of art history, queer studies, and transgender studies, with his writings addressing in the ways in which non-normative genders and sexualities have been fundamental to the shape of art history's narratives. He writes to recover the queer and transgender capacities that have been lost or suppressed in histories of art and performance. This subject is really close to my heart as part of my contributions to the working group KINK, founded in 2019 for the purpose of beginning the long but crucial process of writing a history of queer Australian art. Along with Courtney Coombs, Amelia Barracan, Callum McGrath, and Spiros Panagiorakis, we have earlier this year shared the initial stage of this project, which is a platform hosting the profiles of over 100 queer Australian artists from the early 20th century through to the present, which is viewable at queeraustralianart.com. But beyond simply writing this history and making it visible, there is much more work to be done on how queer art histories are mobilized and recognized. David, I believe, really leads the way in demonstrating how this is done. In what I think is a really quietly powerful way, he shows us the interdisciplinary importance and value that queer and trans experience can provide to art history and visual practice as a whole, and also culture more broadly. I'll quote David briefly here on what queer art history is, in some cases, already doing, and also still needs to do to properly reflect our nuanced lives as non-normative people. And I quote, "Beyond a revisionist reconstruction of episodes of visibility, however important that is, a queer art history needs to track the ways that structures, institutions, and rhetorics have disallowed variation, simplified complexity, or made non-normative positions unspeakable. It needs to attend to the complex ways that dissemblance, non-disclosure, infiltration, and the vexing of surveillance and scrutiny have also been practices of queer resistance, flourishing, and defiance," end quote. Embracing complexity really, I think, moves us forward as a community. It demands more. It counters simplicity and restriction. It demonstrates our capacity for transgression, sensitive comprehension, and a radical form of expansiveness. It evidences that the way we see the world and the way that we lead our lives isn't simply relevant, but insightful and transformative. Such a position situates queer and trans thought and people as active, integral, vital agents in global cultural discourse, and in fact, shift it in profound ways. Tonight, perhaps we might get a glimpse of that, not to load too much expectation, but a glimpse really of new avenues where we might direct this expansive spirit, as David considers in his paper the queer possibilities and potential of abstraction. Without giving too much away, I'd really like to hand over to David now. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by acknowledging and pay my respects to the traditional owners on the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all First Nations people present here today. I'd also like to thank the Museum of Contemporary Art Australia and the Power Institute at the University of Sydney. In particular, Nicholas Krogan, Mark Ledbury, and Tim Riley-Walsh have all been very welcoming hosts. I'm also grateful to the Art Association of Australia and New Zealand for inviting me to give their keynote and for co-sponsoring this additional lecture in Australia. So, what this talk's going to be is I'm going to give a few case studies and then a few sort of contemporary pathways out, but it'll begin with a kind of more theoretical introduction before we actually start looking at the art. So it's a common refrain to say that being visible is crucial to queer life and politics. To come out, to stand up, to be recognizable to others with whom one might form a community. These calls to action have come to be equated with pride and progress. They express a desire for and a politics of representation. It's often assumed that only through representation and recognition can queer life flourish. Such a politics of visibility demands that queer people serve as representatives of queer life, and their visibility is the catalyst for change in community. However, as any queer person knows well, being seen as queer comes with costs and dangers, as well as pleasures and connections. What of those moments and forms of queer life that refuse to be visible, that enjoy the evasion of detection, or that take a rest from being recognizable. Such positions of non-representation can also be political, transformative, pleasurable, life-saving, and defiant. Abstraction is a practice of non-representation. It turns away from resemblance and the recognizable image. It offers constellations of form, including its component categories, such as shape, material, line, color, process, etc., and it prompts us to engage with formal relations directly, rather than see those elements as an image of something elsewhere or previously seen. Such abstract relations, that is, the intercourse of forms, are foregrounded in abstract art. The question of relations amongst genders, amongst lovers, amongst partners, among others, is also fundamental to the experience of queer life and its politics and all of their varieties. Seeing potential in this analogy, some queer artists have left behind the imaging of bodies, instead turning to abstraction to imagine the many forms that queer life and relations take. Now, abstraction has been employed by queer artists for a long time, and they are among those who adopted it as an avant-garde mode in the earliest years of modernism. Since the 1970s, however, in particular, an increasing number of contemporary artists have chosen abstraction as a means to more openly or more complexly address queer life, non-normativity, and other forms of desire, love, and connection. In this talk, what I'm going to do is focus on brief case studies of 3 artists that I take to be foundational and for the practice of using abstraction to pursuing themes related to queer experience and its politics. My focus will be on the American context, because that's the context I work in. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the ways in which feminist art of the 1970s, with its more direct engagement with the politics of the personal, was the context for some of the most important early versions of queer abstraction. In particular, I will discuss the feminist artists Harmony Hammond and Lula Mae Blocton, focusing on key works in which they arrived at queer abstraction in the 1970s. Both artists continue to make work today, and I would consider them contemporary artists as well. But I'm also going to include the important case of Felix Gonzalez-Torres, who's arguably one of the most frequently cited artists of the late 20th century. And I will track the impact on queer abstraction from that work into more recent practices. Now, my aim here is not to provide a comprehensive statement of what is best understood as an expansive set of capacities. Instead, I'm going to offer you 3 brief stories of queer abstraction. Each of these 3 stories is about relations, from the sexual to the social to the familial. Abstraction turns away from the imitation of how the world looks, and instead it creates an alternative in which to imagine and image other ways of being and relating. This is what Harmony Hammond, Lula Mae Blocton, and Felix Gonzalez-Torres each did with their own pursuit of abstraction. So let's begin. Harmony Hammond curated arguably the first significant exhibition of gay and lesbian art in the United States in 1978. She was also part of the editorial collective who published the Lesbian Art and Artist issue of the feminist journal Heresies, which was the first forthright and politically aimed compendium of lesbian or gay artists' work in the United States context. For this history-making publication, Hammond chose a single work of hers to be illustrated, her abstract assemblage Conch, made that same year. Now, Conch is a double, with its paired obround forms sitting one on top of the other. And with it, Hammond created each by wrapping an internal armature with knotted and bound fabric, which accumulated through layering and tying, thus creating bulk around the armature to the point where the walls of the central void of the forms comes to be pressed together. Over this fabric, Hammond placed layers of pigment, gesso, emulsion, and other translucent painting media to give it a unifying pinkish color and surface. Conch is one of a series of wrapped works made in the late 1970s, such as these, in which Hammond tested the limits of painting, as well as sculpture, and more importantly, proposed these works as evoking the female-identified body and its capacities. She considered the densely wound, bulky fabric to be like muscle surrounding the bone-like armature and covered with a painted chromatic skin. Across her early works, Hammond investigated, in particular, horizontality as a metaphor, and Conque's mirrored double derived from this priority. She had, in 1973, created floor-bound braided fabric tondos before proceeding to investigate wall-bound works with horizontal forms. As she returned to working with the wall, the odd-bound horizontal form recurs throughout other paintings, assemblages, and sculptures of these years, and this exploration of horizontality can be taken as both challenging a verticality, coded as phallic, and as well implying a horizon or a lateral endlessness. Works such as Conque and Durango, which you see here, are in spirited dialogue with the so-called central core imagery of feminist art in these years, in which vaginal forms are depicted or implied. Coined and promoted by the heterosexual feminist artists Miriam Shapiro and Judy Chicago, central core imagery became a prominent and much debated format for feminist art of the 70s. Central core imagery, from abstract to representational, tended to be vertical in its orientation to the floor and the horizon line, and it equated the sexed body with an essentializing account of gender, positing this one-to-one equation as a source of female power and aesthetics. Hammond, by contrast, adapted that imagery by emphasizing the span of the horizontal as, again, another attempt to provide an alternative to verticality's phallic implications and central core imagery's paradoxical echoing of them. While this is an aesthetic and political debate in which Hammond's opened, odd-bound formal vocabulary engaged, she pushed her material process further to signal an eroticism within and among these wrapped laying forms. It is in this way that she attempted to declare a specifically lesbian retort to both phallic verticality and its counterparts offered by heterosexual feminist imagery. But to understand the importance of the horizontal gap in the wrapped works, I will illustrate a different Hammond wall sculpture, of which I have some better detailed photographs, to be honest. Here I'm going to show the larger and slightly later Durango, and here is a life-size sculpture of a chair by Scott Burton for scale. Now, when Hammond described Durango, she remarked that, quote, that it was, quote, a place where my lover and I met and touched. It is about a female sensuous presence as essence made visible, a sense of touch, unquote. As the art historian Margot Hobbs has shown in multiple extensive, excellent articles on Hammond and lesbian art, the wrapping form was explicitly erotic for Hammond, who polemically used it to express lesbian experience and potential. Now, the reclining central cores of Hammond's Durango and Conque have been worked, with their boundaries repeatedly touched and wrapped in the process of laying down the fibrous textile layers. These sculptures are the result of hands working in and through those central forms. They showcase the way in which these surfaces have been touched and pulled and tied. They also bear the evidence of the movement of hands and fingers in and through the void at the center of the armature. The material and processual focus encourages a reading of these works as records of being touched, filled, and circled by Hammond's hands. There is an erotic implication of this process once we see the abstract form, the squeezing inward, thickening, rounded, horizontal band, seeing it as a result of the layered and squeezing hands of fabric into and out of that core. As one of the earliest versions of these wrapped wall works, Conque foregrounds the lesbian potential of this eroticized way of making. It comprises two substitutable forms that touch, one laying on top of the other. These two wrapped ellipses demand attention to their own labor-intensive process of coming into being through Hammond's durational acts of handwork. They are bulky and fulsome, with their resulting horizontally mirrored forms pressing against each other and into themselves in a cascade of contact that makes interior and exterior seem like irrelevant descriptors of this embrace. In this first, most polemical version of the wrapped horizontal in her practice, Hammond used the double to represent queer potential. Remember, this was the work that she chose as the single illustration for the Lesbian Art and Artists issue. This work makes that reading manifest through these two sensuous forms, both highly suggestive when understood in the context of the aesthetic and political debates about women's imagery in the 1970s. This work wears its process on its sleeve, and it tells the story of these two forms coming into being through Hammond's repeated manual attention to the continuities between their mirrored insides and outsides. In other wrapped works, Hammond would also use the tactile contact between doubled forms to imply a potential intimacy, eroticism, or love. For instance, hug features two ladder-like forms propped up against each other. The ladder is a vertical form defined through its internal spaces. Its functionality only occurs by breaking open the vertical with these helpful and supportive gaps. A ladder only works because you can interweave with it, and the spaces hold and care for the one who presses their body against it as a means to go higher. I understand Hammond's use of the ladder form as an answer to the question of finding a compromise between anthropomorphic verticality and central core imagery. With its structuring voids, it is a non-phallic vertical, and it smartly offers a retort to the statuary tradition's emphasis on the monolithic form of the statue. Ladders, after all, are meant to be hugged closely. Or in another touching double, she uses these same worked, gapped, yet fulsome forms in pairs to imply not exact sameness, but substitutability and likeness. And again, the double is made intimate through its touching adjacency. Hammond has been the most articulate and long-running proponent of queer abstraction in the United States context. And I emphasize this early moment in the formative years of American feminist art as a means of signaling that importance. But I would also point out that, again, she continues with an incredibly robust practice today, that her paintings in the most recent Whitney Biennial were absolutely stunning and carry through some of these questions into today. But it was in the 1970s where some feminist artists turned to abstract art as a way out of the contradiction of figuration, with its long history of the objectification of the female-identified form and in its histories. Leaving behind the traditions of the figure, abstract artists instead created a zone in which bodily analogies and empathies could be wrought through form and materiality. For Hammond, the challenge was to think about how an erotics of sameness could be rendered in such material and formal terms, thinking about sex and love and support, but without encouraging that kind of lurid objectification that often harried lesbian representation. For Hammond, abstraction was a defensive position, to be sure, but it also opened out to a larger account of how intimacy and relations could be envisioned through form and material. Now, for another artist, a contemporary of Hammond's, I want to turn to a painter working these same years, who also visualized new possibilities, moving from the queer couple to the queer community. In 1975, Lula Mae Blocton made her painting Summer Ease out of a feeling of happiness and potential in finding a community. This airy, yet dense vernal painting of interwoven and plaited translucent bands came from a time of change in her life and art, when, she said, quote, "I learned how to translate personal responses to my environment via color," unquote. Blocton had moved to New Jersey from the Midwest in 1972 because of a teaching job at Keene University. And it was there that she met her partner and later wife, Shirley Bernstein, who was teaching printmaking. Her relationship with Bernstein encouraged her to move to New York City in 1973, where Blocton began to find connection with others like her. She had joined with a group of artists to form the New Jersey-based collective Black Women in Visual Perspective, and she also participated in the newly visible out post-Stonewall lesbian and gay culture in what she herself described as, quote, "then the gayest city in the US and the art capital of the world," unquote. Her quote, not mine. Across and within these new communities, Blocton found herself grounded in ways previously denied of her. Of these years, she recalled, quote, "There was a rebelliousness involved with that because I saw how women, lesbians, gay, LGBTQ, how our community was just being completely not taken seriously at all. And so I decided at one point that I was just going to try to be as true to myself as I could, be in my studio as much as I could, and try to make images as true to me as I could," unquote. Summer Ease marked that transition in Blocton's work. She was and continues to be a committed abstractionist, using precise color theory in her paintings to stage interactions and overlaps between hues. Previously, she had employed the modernist grid. She painted fields of squares made from regulated bands of color and equal widths. But in 1975, she left the ordered geometry of the repeated square to one side. Blocton explained, quote, "When I came to New York initially, I felt a grid, a structured environment. And as I stayed and became more comfortable, it became less so. I started to feel the geometry of the city, the architectural aspect of the city. And it wasn't primarily based on any kinds of squares. It was based on changing the rectangular shapes." As the art historian Barbara Steele remarked about this moment, Blocton, quote, "loosened the weave," that, unquote, that had determined her earlier abstract paintings. So Blocton did not abandon the weave as a structure. She only traded its rigidity for variation. Weaving, she said, is, quote, "about the actual physical threads being together," unquote. In comparison to her earlier works, Summer Ease exhibited a formal relaxation of the rules that had previously bound her precise experiments with form. Blocton credited this painting with a move to a more intuitive process of geometric abstraction as well as color. The palette at first seems to be unified by sunny pastels, yet it also contained intense purples, browns, greens, chartreuse, and orange hues. Blocton aimed to create the appearance of transparency and translucency, effects which are usually rendered in oil paint through the depiction of objects layered in space. But Blocton's abstractions offer little to no pictorial space or recognizable objects or materials. Rather, she pushed her use of oil paint to depict the optical effect of transparency through the shallow pictorial field of the woven grid. Blocton explained, quote, "The idea of transparency is that you're able to not only see the surface, but you see through it. And then colors become able to work with one another, one over another, under another, and work as a whole image," unquote. The perpendicular thresholds, where the vertical and the horizontal bands connect, are where the optical effects of transparency become the most apparent. At those moments of overlap, there is sometimes a sliver of opacity, where the touch of two colors compounds and redoubles. The bands find new possibilities in each lateral passage and climb through the open weave of the painting, and we are directed to those moments of contact. In short, Summer Ease transforms the irregular grid into a symphony of connections among individual colored bands that activate each other as they contribute to the whole. Summer Ease is a painting about relations and the capacity for mutual inflection, and it alludes to the summer's warmth that brings people out together. However abstract, it attempts to capture that light, that heat, and that ease of Blocton's summer of possibility, affection, and new attachments in 1975. Her painting drew from her newfound connections and the vibrancy and potential of her new city, where she had found love, community, and support. Blocton recalled, quote, "We banded together, and we did have a community, a wonderful community of people accepting each other, but we were all just struggling. We were struggling just to stay in New York, survive, pay the rent, feed ourselves, and then try to change attitudes as much as we could," unquote. In the 1970s, queer people often came to cities, not just to find a place to escape, but also to find support and others like them. Blocton's painting was an attempt to convey the queer life that she had begun to find in New York. Summer Ease is grounded in the queer experience of finding that possibility in community after isolation and misunderstanding. The painting's manifesting of the intensity of connection is open-ended and generous. Any can be welcomed into this family. The human form is neither referenced nor implied, to say nothing about presumptions of its genders or sexualities. Yet these painted bands evokes the acts of bearing others, touching others, being seen through others, and being enmeshed in something that is more than the sum of its parts. Blocton's story reminds us that even the most committed, formalist modes of abstraction can be made to allude to or to allegorize social relations through the playing out of formal relations. This can be accomplished without signaling or imagining a body. Relations, both formal and social, need not be prescriptive or proscriptive, but rather can be open to new conjugations and combinations. Now, these first two stories that I've told you, I have emphasized myself a very formalist approach to them. And this is intentional, right? I have been trying to lean into the account of the material and formal traits of the work to show that in our very modes of looking at these made objects, our ekphrastic account of them can be motivated by a queer perspective. I've rooted both of these previous analyses in the specific art theoretical discourses of the time or in the biographical accounts of these artists, and that helps give us a way of justifying this queer reading, to be sure. But I want to emphasize that that we sometimes need a formalism, queer formalism, in order to account for abstraction. And by thinking of the ways in which we allegorize such queer relations through formal relations is one thing that has both motivated artists, but has also motivated people to look at abstraction queerly. But now I'm going to move to our final story, which is kind of a different mode. And this is about the creation of a queer symbol. So I know more than a few artists and art historians who have tattoos that reference Felix Gonzalez-Torres' untitled Perfect Lovers. Indeed, this has become such a phenomenon that currently the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. has an exhibition of Gonzalez-Torres' work up, and they are having a panel session on Felix Gonzalez-Torres tattoos. So it's not just me. So, excuse me. Now, Untitled Perfect Lovers is the most frequent of these tattoos and perhaps Gonzalez-Torres' most famous work. It's not hard to see why. This now famous work creates abundance from restraint. A pair of circular battery-powered clocks touch at the outermost edge of their horizontal diameters. They mark time's passage in what is both a sculpture and a conceptual performance. Untitled Perfect Lovers allegorizes love and relationships through its synchronized dyadic couple, but the work also tells the story of how all love ends in loss. Though identical, the two clocks inevitably step out of sync as one of the two batteries begins to fail before the other. Even if we do not see it now, the moment when one continues on alone is on the horizon. Gonzalez-Torres defied, but did not deny, that finality by tasking the owners of his works to reset the clocks and renew the batteries, setting in motion again the cycle of togetherness and its parting. In this way, this work is both hopeful and fatalistic. It holds back time, even as it predicts its inevitable outcome. Untitled Perfect Lovers is frequently explained in connection with the toll of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s, and it was made at a time when queer life was punctuated by almost weekly funerals, daily caregiving, and rage at societal and governmental neglect. I cannot see this work outside of that context, but nevertheless, this work also exceeds and moves beyond its time. From those crucible years, this work's story has emerged as almost universal, a tale of all lovers, the tragedy of their divergent departures, and the ideal of their eternal renewal. It is this work's simplicity and openness that allows so many to see themselves reflected in its mirroring. It presents devotion as sameness, literalized in the two circular units side by side. The pair, indeed, offers an unforeclosed presentation of who a couple can be, and it does not rely on a calculus of gender to define love. Its reductive homogeneity of form prompts an expansive heterogeneity of possible identifications. Soon after making the initial work, Gonzalez-Torres turned it into an abstraction. The clock's outlines were recast as two abutting equal circles printed for Untitled Double Portrait in 1991, which was one of his renewable stacked paper works. It is a simple geometric form made from these two endless lines, these two circles. But this title reminds us that it can be read, again, as a metaphoric couple. Like Untitled Perfect Lovers, the parenthetical addition of double portrait lends to the circles a prosopopeia, a personification of an abstraction. The abstract form of touching identical circles became important to Gonzalez-Torres, and he went on to recreate it using mirrors, brass hoops, and large-scale stone circles with water, as in the United States Pavilion at the 2007 Biennale. It is this icon that has made its way into the tattoos of art lovers, sometimes with the hands of the dial, sometimes not. And it has been cited by many and many subsequent artists and designers. Gonzalez-Torres distilled his own work into this abstract image of the couple and devotion, one which offers openly to reflect the devotion of any two lovers. Because of this abstraction and the many reflections of love it has sustained, this pair of circles has become indeed a queer symbol. Over the last 3 decades since Gonzalez-Torres' Untitled Perfect Lovers, any artwork with two abutting circles is presumed to be in dialogue with it. This is either by direct citation or by pseudomorphosis, that is, an inadvertent lookalike. Either way, the image of touching circles has stabilized into an unavoidable queer iconography, one with much engaging, effective, and complex work that has been done around it. Perhaps my favorite such work in dialogue with this is Prem Sahib's Two Dots from 2013. Precariously perched on the left side of a long white aluminum rod hung high on the wall, two small, identical, pale blue discs huddled together. The geometric abstraction of this work, however, is loaded with reference. Building on the imagery of the paired circle, Sahib activated other, more local meanings when this was exhibited in the United Kingdom some 10 years ago. At that time, two side-by-side blue dots were an indication of a positive result on the INSTI take-home HIV test, which was the first such rapid test to be widely available in London. A blue dot, the control, was joined by another if HIV was detected. Two dots became a visual symbol of being HIV positive, and Sahib took inspiration from a short play of the same name by his friend Manuel Ramos. Sahib also made a later companion work, Undetectable, that featured two white dots, an image, of course, that the HIV test could never display. Now, Sahib had been using acrylic discs in other works, but he found that when paired, these ushered in further meaning. He recalled, quote, "Although an explicit reference to Felix Gonzalez-Torres wasn't something that led me to make these works initially, it was something that I was aware of as an inevitable association. It was surprising to me how effective and poignant these associations could be through a kind of inherited language. Also, as something generational when talking about things like loss, relationships, and change," unquote. Sahib's Two Dots is a formally concise abstract sculpture, and it draws on the iconography of the paired circle to offer a new engagement with the ongoing emotional and political context of HIV/AIDS. Unlike Gonzalez-Torres' clocks, however, this work does not perform the passage of time. Instead, it dwells on the significance of an event, the positive result, without predicting its future. Now, the imagery of the paired circle operates differently in my two examples, but the recurrence of this geometric form in these and other works attests to how a queer iconography coalesced and became repeatable. Gonzalez-Torres' own practice of abstracting and then recalling the form of untitled perfect lovers in his subsequent work established this visual vocabulary to be employed, alluded to, or cited by others. That distillation of a concept and its generous openness into a visual form is a key factor in how this work came to be so popular and widely cited. Sahib's two dots and other artists' use of the paired circle are not limited by this reference, but rather they adapt and draw from its currency and commonality. Across such stories of generation and transmission, an abstraction emerged as a recurring symbol for queer potential. Now, this story reminds us that queer abstraction is sometimes about a citation of another queer abstraction that has come before. These conversations cross times and places and are themselves evidence of the ways that others have seen abstraction queerly. Second, however, I would point that there is also a cautionary element to this story. Referential chains of queer abstractions may settle into stable and repeatable iconographies, but such readily recognizable imagery is what many artists who work in queer abstraction seek to transcend. Time will tell. Now, in this talk, I've been aiming for deeper reads of individual works of queer abstraction rather than attempt some broad survey. I mean, it should be clear from my three examples that there is no one quick way to recognize a queer abstraction. Instead, one needs to think with the artist about the meaningfulness of practice, the commitments to form, and the long-running development of the visual vocabularies. Some might see these as obstacles to the work, preferring the clearly visible or the immediately apparent. By contrast, I want to value such slow reveals, and I stress that we must get to know the art to see its queer capacities. After all, we don't really know another person when we first see them, nor can we immediately be assured of their gender or sexuality. Why should we assume that of an artwork? When we linger with a work and get to know its desires, its needs, its priorities, we can see differently how it might speak to our own experience or even show us a different pathway to visualization. Queer abstraction often requires such commitment, and it spurns transparency and a politics of visibility in favor of relationships in which complexity and particularity are disclosed slowly and deliberately. Now, as I said at the beginning, there are many contemporary artists working from such priorities, seeing an abstraction a way to vex surveillance, to open up an account of relations, or to think complexly about the queer experiences of non-disclosure, dissemblance, and the intimate reveal. I want to conclude with very briefly mentioning three Australian examples of current artists committed to queer abstraction. Spence Messe, for instance, has purposely adapted some of the tenets of minimalism in works such as You Move on the Other Side Of. Here, the flat plane becomes dimensional through the fold, and this intervention creates a form that casts shadows on the surface. It's a simple move, but it is one that creates dimensionality. There is now an inside and an outside. What was a regular form, a rectangle, becomes complex. This work is coated with testosterone gel, a substance that is regulated and difficult to obtain without legal and medical approval. Messe uses this substance in a rogue way, lining the thin edge of the powder-coated steel planes. This addition reinforces the metaphor of bodily and gender transformation that is being played out formally in this work. With the folded-up corner, we see what had previously been hidden by this floor-bound plane. A new side is possible through the breaking with regularity, and the formerly hidden inside becomes the visible exterior. For another example, the paintings of Christine Dean often use the recognizability and modularity of the letter form, at once both specific and abstractable. And these are a tool to address multiplicities of meanings and readings. In a series of works engaging with the central core imagery and its feminist heritage that I was talking about earlier, Dean's paintings think about how that essentialist logic fractures or is made available from the perspective of trans experience. Organized around a central form, Dean has mobilized the letter forms so that they interlock, creating new possibilities and suggesting meanings in formation. At times, readability breaks down. At others, it is flirtatiously alluded to. Importantly, in these paintings, we struggle to read, to interpret, and the paintings rebuff our attempts to know and recognize immediately. In this sense, the painting is in line with the core strategy of queer abstraction, that is to vex immediate recognizability and question the terms of visibility in which surveillance and categorization are inevitable outcomes. For my third quick example, in a 2023 exhibition in Melbourne, Andrew Acheson also used text as a means to abstraction, here in the form of redacted phrases from queer theoretical treatises. These borrowed and treasured phrases act as lightning rods for ideas and actions. Acheson's quotations are made material, fabulously so, with their glowing polychrome anatomy. Here, a phrase from the queer theorist Jose Esteban Munoz is used, quote, "a great refusal," unquote. But these wall works are also guarded from our attempts to dissect them. Their blank parallelograms shield the phrases. Radiating yet redacted, Acheson's wall sculptures both offer a message and withhold it. The neon's colors are perceived indirectly through their absorption of the white walls on which they hang. Like the talisman that stands for the beyond, we don't see the thing itself, only its radiant effects. Instead, we are faced with the screens underneath which the words burn, and we fill those purposeful blanks with our own inquisitions and projections. Like other queer abstractions, they refuse an equation of seeing and knowing. Instead, they propose a mode of coded indirectness that is itself a manifestation of queer ways of surviving detection, surveillance, and visibility. There is pleasure in turning away from scrutiny, after all. Now, I've given these three examples from Australia far too briefly, and there's much more to be said about all of these artists' works. But I wanted to give a sense of the many different ways in which the very idea of a queer abstraction can be catalytic in both an artist's practice and in the way that we might intimately view it, its forms and materials. No two queer abstractions will look alike, nor should they. It is an open question of about how we might see the forms of our own relations differently. If anything, we should trust that abstraction has capacity. It is productive and proliferative. Rather than an avoidance of representation, it must be considered an embrace of potentiality and a positing of the unforeclosed. Relations are meaningful, ethical, and political, and it is in the intercourse of forms that abstract art proposes new visions of them. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm happy to take some questions. Okay, I think we have to wait for the mics. Here they come.
Thank you. Oh, hi, David. I'm Christine Dean, by the way.
Nice to meet you.
It could be argued that Clement Greenberg championed a form of queer abstraction, particularly when he came to Australia, and we might call it homosocial hard-edge abstraction, which really became part of the DNA of Australian art. And I'm just wondering if you felt, giving this lecture outside of the US, particularly in an Antipodean context, if you have the shadow of, or the spectre of Clement Greenberg over your shoulder.
No. But I will say that one of the things that in my larger historical practice, one of the things I'm very invested in is, there's two different things. One is by demonstrating that there are queer ways of reading in artworks and texts that are not immediately apparent. Right? So thinking about how something like Blocton's Summer Ease can be made different through an intimacy with it. But second, much of my historical work has been very focused on how queer capacities or trans capacities are proposed inadvertently from other means. And so my book on abstract sculpture was, had a chapter on David Smith, who arrived at gender multiplicity through this. I would say Greenberg as well, an extreme ideological approach towards abstraction is always bound to fail. And it also opens out to these other possibilities. I mean, this is what I found with working on the ABEX sculptor David Smith, is that commitment to thinking about abstraction, but alluding to the body in different ways, produced this queer capacity. Now, in terms of Greenberg himself, I think the sort of clubbiness of Greenberg that you're alluding to is, it would be interesting to track the ways in which he could only recognize as someone in the family if they shared enough resemblances to the other people. I mean, this is why de Kooning, for instance, gets exiled. To be thinking about how those lateral relations between artists are nevertheless supporting of them, even though the rhetoric of abstract expression is of the heroic, autonomous, singular artist, but they actually all kind of need each other. So that's what I'm taking for that great homosocial hard edge abstraction. Good phrase. So it's interesting to think about how those kinds of family resemblances and those intimacies of adjacency that we might think of not just in terms of forms, but in terms of the social engagements of artists, or how practices abut next to each other, might be a way to read queerness into those movements. But there's a long answer to say no about Greenberg in particular.
Could I follow up, David,
Sure.
from that? Being a victim of Clement Greenberg as well, as many of us were in 1968 when he came to this city. Relating to abstraction and your concept of abstraction, one of the things that he would say about an artist such as Willem de Kooning was that he had a kind of, his work, which at certain points did look, or to many people look, entirely abstract, and was clearly deeply committed to processes of abstracting itself in all sorts of ways. He used the phrase homeless representation. That was his phrase for what was going on in the work of someone like de Kooning. That somehow the representational element had lost its home, was homeless. And to me that was always false and poor reading, because he was really talking about a kind of fugitive figuration, right? The ways in which different kinds of figuring haunt abstract painting, and whether they do so to the extent of making a total pure abstraction impossible, right? That, in a way, within the kind of framework of the 60s and 70s, when the contrast between, we inherited this Cold War battle between figuration or abstraction, and this incredible tendency, which your whole talk has so brilliantly worked against, the tendency of reducing everything to, one thing or one big category. But there's still a challenge just in the word abstraction and using it in a way that it self-abstracts, generalizes and grows. And so I was just wondering whether within the works that you're looking at, this issue of having a kind of abstraction that does not have any chimera or any figurations involved, whether you see examples of that, or would that quest be a ridiculous one in the context of the work you're looking at?
Not at all. I mean, first of all, I want to just speak, I'm going to move back and speak from the contemporary context first. Most contemporary artists working today could care less about an opposition between figuration and abstraction. Suit your mood. right? And they will work between them and adapt them. And so I wouldn't want, my analysis of these quite extreme versions of abstraction should not be taken as kind of as a statement that I believe there shouldn't be any figuration. There's plenty of other modes of this that we could think about in which that opposition is just not irrelevant. But I think one of the interesting things about talking about abstract art is that there is always recourse to metaphor. The ways in which highly formalist artworks are justified by the artist in the studio, how they're communicated to another artist, to a critic, to someone else, or the ways in which they're seen, there's always a recourse to metaphor. Now, for Greenberg, that metaphor was the teleological Hegelian progress towards the purity of form, but that's it's the narrative of progress was one of these things that all of the works could be seen as metaphorically related to. We could also recast that teleology as, again, as we already started to here, as a story of family allegiances, lineages, and a patrilineal succession, right? So already you can see that I could draw out from Greenberg's account some of these ways in which people and bodies and relations and communities are not far behind. What I really like about the 1970s, however, is that they've gotten over the hangover of Greenbergian of abstraction a little, and especially within feminist American art of the 70s, there's a group of committed abstract artists who understand that the body and relations are deeply political, but that the representation of bodies lends themselves to objectification and counter-feminist aims. And so abstraction becomes imbued by someone like Hammond with bodily resonance and metaphor in an explicit way that mobilizes this, and that also kind of makes this opposition between figuration and abstraction much more complex and no longer about art theoretical questions, but about political questions. So I always center this narrative in that work and trying to think about those questions. But I would also say, just to back to Clement for a second, it was with sculpture that he had the biggest problem because he couldn't get over David Smith's constant return to the format of the statue, no matter how much Smith himself wanted to get rid of it. And he allowed figuration and metaphor in sculpture, which is a way in which his own ideology of pure abstraction begins to break down. And so in both Smith's practice and in Greenberg's accounts and in later accounts, the metaphors through which abstraction are used often bring in the social, the personal, the bodily, and the relational. And so this is one of the ways in which I understand artists working with queer abstraction think about, mobilize accounts of relations in their practice as a way of activating and drawing on that metaphor. I taught in an art school for 16 years, and everybody, all of those studios, every artist really cares about the line, the pile of dirt, that whatever they're doing, there is a deep meaning for that. And I just want to take that seriously as a way of thinking about how those are also ethical positions, conceptual positions, as well as formal articulations. And so drawing out especially the ways in which either queer abstraction can be a mode of practice that's done by artists, or a mood of reception that's done by the viewers, the critics, elsewhere. There's different ways in which we can find in abstraction's openness ways to narrate non-normative, unprescribed relations or embodiments. Hopefully that didn't sound too much like a manifesto. There are other questions. This one right here. Oops.
Thanks very much for a really beautiful reading of those works. When it comes to, there's an Australian example I'd also like to draw your attention to, the abstract work of Vivian Binns. Vivian was a friend of Harmony Hammond, actually, and she does very interesting abstracts of things like lino patterns, floor linoleum patterns, and so on, of domestic space. And she's kind of speculating on the sort of unknown abstract artists who would have done those kinds of designs in the paintings that she draws on. But thanks very much for your lecture, and it just drew forth for me that other example, which had that historical link actually with the work you've presented.
Thank you. So when I've been talking about queer abstraction for probably too long. And I used to give, whenever I was asked to give a lecture, I used to try and do a survey, like a historical survey, and I'd start with someone like Marsden Hartley and go up to the contemporary and, I do that. And it became far too long of a lecture to try and give a little snippet here and there and try to put everything in. There are wide and varied practices that I would encourage you all to go find and to seek out. And so this more recent version of my engagement with these topics is kind of invested in, is trying to demonstrate what a formalism looks like when we go. That's why I focus on these works, but also showing how that the methodology of studying queer abstraction does require that kind of intimacy with the work. And so that's why you only get like 6 artists instead of 60, but I'm always happy to hear more because there are plenty more. Is there anything? Okay, I think that's it. So thank you very much. Thanks.